All right. So I'm going to go ahead and get started by sharing a little bit about myself. So I am Rachel Dosine. I am a licensed nonprofit consultant. I love nonprofits. Nonprofits has been my life for over 2 decades. I started my nonprofit career actually has been my career has been in nonprofits for over 2 decades now. And about maybe 10 years ago, when I graduated with my master's, I decided to start my own business. And one of the services I offered was nonprofit consulting. And since then, I have dedicated most of my business to that. So the majority of the work I do is with nonprofits, from helping nonprofits to start to getting started and figuring out if nonprofit is the right route for you, because sometimes it's not. I am not one of those like consultants, nonprofit consultants, who takes every client who wants to start a nonprofit and says, "Yes, I'll help you start it. Give me your money, and I'll help you get started." No, I'm not. I'm not at all that sort of consultant. When somebody wants to meet with me about starting a nonprofit, I have a conversation with them, and there's some questions that I ask them. And there have been times when folks have changed their minds about starting a nonprofit, or I've educated them out of. I don't say that I talk them out of, but I educate them out of starting a nonprofit because they realize that they would have more impact doing what they want to do via another route. Right. So I seriously enjoy the work. I'm very passionate about nonprofit work. Um, I am passionate about community service, about giving back. And I truly believe that each of us, part of our purpose, it doesn't matter where you are in your life, it doesn't matter what religious background you're from, where you find yourself career wise, that we all have a duty in some way, shape, or form to leave this world better than we found it. And so community service, giving back is really important to me. It's something that in our household is one of our core values. And so as my husband and I are raising our son, that is one of the things that we have spent a lot of time cultivating in him, is the idea that you have a responsibility to your fellow human, a responsibility to be a blessing when you've been blessed, and it doesn't matter how little or how much. That you look for opportunities to make the world a better place, look for opportunities to serve others. And so that's pretty much about me and my nonprofit experience. I'm also a creative, so I have a business. I sew, I make bracelets, I make jewelry, actually, not just bracelets. I paint. So I have a whole creative side to me as well. I'm a wife. I've been married for 18 years. Wow. I'm married for 18 years now. My husband and I have a 16-year-old son. I'm also the wife of a police officer. So my husband's a police officer in Baltimore City, Maryland. And I am excited to be here. Teresa Satchel, thank you so much for this opportunity to share my passion, to share my knowledge, and to share my expertise with your audience. All right, so let's delve right in. So the format of tonight is going to be a Q&A. Now I posted in the Kingdom Legacy Partnerships group if anyone had any questions about nonprofits that they would like me to answer tonight. I didn't get any questions, so what I did was I gathered together the 10 frequently asked questions that I get about nonprofits, whether it's when I'm having a conversation with a prospective new client, or just generally what I see as I surf the World Wide Web, or when I hear folks talking about nonprofit. I drafted 10 questions that I think will answer the gamut, will answer most information that folks want to know about a nonprofit, whether it's starting one or running one. Running one, these questions should answer or provide some information. Right, so I'm just going to go through the questions. I'll ask the questions and I'll answer them. If you are watching or you are on the replay, watching on the replay, grab a pen and a notepad. If starting a nonprofit is something that is of interest to you, or you are currently part of a nonprofit, whether you sit on the board or you are the founder of a nonprofit, you might want to grab a pen and paper so you can get some information tonight from what I am saying, because I am hoping that what I'm providing tonight will be of value and of benefit. All right, so let us get started. So before I start the 10 questions, I want to set the base. So what is a nonprofit? So a nonprofit essentially is a charity. A nonprofit is really not a we'll say a real term. It's really not for profit. Charity, those are the words that are normally used legally. So IRS or your state, when you register in your state, it's most times you see charity or not for profit. And a not-for-profit normally falls within the 501c IRS revenue code, right? If to be officially a tax-exempt organization, you will fall within the 501c. The most popular type of nonprofit is a 501c3. And a 501c3 covers religious, charitable, education. It covers several gamuts, several industries that you can fall into when it comes to nonprofits. There are probably, I think, maybe about 13 or 14 different 501cs. So you can be a 501c5, you can be a 501c7, you could be a 501c14. And all of those come with very specific stipulations. For the most part, the nonprofits that I assist are 501c3s. Those are the most common nonprofits that exist. There are almost 2 million of them in the US. And we'll talk a little bit about that later about, should you or shouldn't you start a nonprofit? And that's one of the questions that I have tonight. So I want to lay that groundwork as to defining what a nonprofit is. When you register in your state, which is the first step to the process, it will be characterized as a charity. And then you register with the federal government, you get your 501c3, and you become a tax-exempt organization. Registering in your state as a charity does not make you tax-exempt. Tax exemption is an IRS distinction. So as far as your state is concerned, you need to learn what your state regulations are. Every state may be different in what the process is for applying for a charity and what the expectations are for reporting as a charity. I look a little fuzzy. I don't know why. Okay, there we go. I'm going to try not to move too much because my camera, I guess, technology and me tonight. Anyway, so make sure you're clear on what your state laws are around a charity or a nonprofit, right? That's the first piece. After you've registered in your state, then you are ready to register with the federal government if you intend to be a tax-exempt organization. And as a tax-exempt organization, there is a paperwork you have to complete, an application that you have to complete in order to be considered and approved or disapproved by the IRS as one, right? So that's pretty much in a nutshell, generally that's the process. All right, so let's start with our questions. First question, and I'm not going in any particular order. Who owns a nonprofit? Lots of times when I work with clients, I'll hear my nonprofit, my charity, my foundation. You do not own a nonprofit. So if you start a nonprofit, you are not the owner. Why? Because a nonprofit is not a private business. So you as the founder do not own and cannot own a nonprofit. A nonprofit is owned by the people of the state in which it is started. So I'm in Maryland. So if I started a nonprofit in Maryland, the people of the state of Maryland essentially are the owners of that particular nonprofit. And the board of directors is responsible for governing that body. It's a governing body. They have fiduciary responsibility. And that's a whole separate question as to what the board expectations are. But as far as owning a nonprofit, the founder, the person who starts a nonprofit, does not own it, right? There's no ownership per se in that way because it is not a private business. It is a public business. So a nonprofit's finances, a nonprofit's bylaws, any of that stuff is public record. So if someone asks a particular nonprofit for any of those documents, it should be provided because it's a public entity. It's not a private business like Kingdom Legacy Partnerships or my own Compass Consulting and Training Solutions, right? Those are private businesses owned by myself and Teresa. And so it's not publicly owned, so we don't have to present any of our documents or anything to the public, right? So a nonprofit is a public entity. That's first, right? So let's get that clear. So there's no I, it's the board. It's the nonprofit I founded. Those are things that you can say, but there is no my nonprofit or there is no such thing, right? You cannot own a nonprofit. Second question, what are the responsibilities of the nonprofit board? This is so important for founders, those who are starting a nonprofit. It is so important for you to be clear on what the expectations and the role of the board of directors is. In addition to that, it's very important that you ensure that your board, the board of the organization, and when I use the term "your" in this conversation, I'm talking in terms of the nonprofit. You need to ensure that the board is trained and understand clearly what their roles and responsibilities are. The roles and responsibilities of a board of directors is serious business. It is not I'm Jamaican, so as I say in Jamaica, it's not a joke thing. It's serious business, right? A nonprofit essentially, or a charity essentially, is a business, right? And that's coming out the gate. It is a business. What is the business? Doing good. But you need to operate. A nonprofit needs to operate with some of the same business principles. This is not a, kumbaya, hold hands, jump around, sweet and nice, fly by the seat of your pants type of situation. It's a starting a nonprofit and running a nonprofit, as far as the board is concerned, is a very serious business. There are legal repercussions that can occur if the board does not function as is written in its articles of incorporation, as is written in its bylaws, and as is written for the laws of that state, because each state has very specific charity laws that you need to be aware of, and the IRS code. You need to make sure that you're functioning within those. So the board has what is called fiduciary responsibility, which means that essentially the board, and the board meaning the collection of people that are voted in and identified as the board, have total responsibility. You have financial responsibility, you have governance responsibility, you have ethical responsibilities for this nonprofit. So it is your responsibility as the board to ensure that the nonprofit is sustainable, that it's bringing enough money to function, that you are following all the laws of the state and of the federal government, to ensure that you are upholding your bylaws and your articles of incorporation, to ensure that the programs that are being ran by the nonprofit are in line with the mission, to ensure that you are functioning as an ethical board. No one on the board should be paid of a nonprofit board. This is purely 100% a volunteer position, and no one should be benefiting from being on the board. So for example, the board decides that it's time to build a facility. And on the board, there is someone who owns a construction company. That board member should not automatically get that contract because they're on the board. That is not the reason for being on the board. So folks should not be on the board to gain financial gain, or even if it's not financial, to gain exposure, to gain clout, whatever the case is. No, those are ethical issues that have repercussions. Now, the board member is welcomed to submit a proposal like everybody else. So you do a call for proposal for this construction. And the board member can submit a proposal, and the board itself can decide without that board member present. So when you're discussing this, a board member who submitted his or her proposal should not be present. The board can decide whether or not they're going to allow the proposal to be accepted or not. If they allow it to be accepted and then they decide that, okay, we're going to go with this board member's proposal, it needs to be carefully documented in the minutes, right? Board members should not be benefiting from being on a nonprofit board. And it's really important to make that clear, because lots of times folks will sit on a nonprofit board for that reason, because they know there's something to be had or something to be made. And lots of times when you see these scandals that happen with nonprofits, lots of times it happens around money, the spending of it, and ethics of how money is exchanged and how money is spent as it relates to that particular board, right? So the board has responsibility, not the founder, not the executive director, not the CEO. The board has responsibility for the nonprofit, and the buck stops at the board, right? The board will hire and fire the CEO or executive director of a nonprofit, right? So there's the board, then you may have the CEO, or it may be an executive director. That person reports directly to the board. The board as a unit is their boss. And then under them, you have, the C-suite or other types of leadership positions, and then however the makeup of the organization is, right? So the board has fiduciary responsibility for the nonprofit. Question number 3, how much does it cost to start a nonprofit? There's really not a one-size-fits-all question to this. And here's why. Every state has a different cost for registering a charity in that state. Some states it's $100 and something. Some states it's $50, $60, $70, right? So it really depends on what the cost is in that particular state. Sorry, my nose is itching. It really depends on the cost of that particular state. So that's the first cost that you have to consider. The second cost is then the 1023 form. The 1023, which is the IRS form that you complete in order to get your tax exempt status. There's two types of those forms. There's a 1023-EZ, and the 1023-EZ are for organizations that plan to make $50,000 or less each year for the first 3 years. So in the first 3 years, you can only make your max of gross receipts is $50,000 per year, right? If that's what you project that the nonprofit that is being started will make, you can do the 1023-EZ. That is about $275, I believe. I'm almost sure it's about $275. Then you have the 1023, the long form. So if you project that the nonprofit is going to make significantly more, like hundreds of thousands of dollars, within its first 3 years, you need to fill out the long form. In the long form, it's about $600 to complete. And the long form can have hundreds of pages of attachments because you have to attach a lot of things to it and then send it into the IRS. The 1023-EZ, you could do it online. It'll probably take you 15, 20 minutes, maybe 30 minutes if you have everything that you need gathered to complete. And then you just wait to hear from the IRS to see if your application is accepted or not. So the cost really, the minimal cost depends on that. The other piece is, are you having a lawyer, or are you getting assistance from a nonprofit consultant like myself that can help you not only file the application, but there are documents that you will need to create: your bylaws, your articles of incorporation, your conflict of interest policy, your conflict of interest sheet for folks to sign off on, your mission statement, like there are other pieces that go into starting this nonprofit. So the cost would also depend on, are you utilizing a professional to complete the application for you? And or are you using a consultant like myself to also help you get the nonprofit itself started? So cost, it really depends. The other thing that I also tell folks, ideally when you start a nonprofit, you should have a plan for how you are going to fund the nonprofit for at least the first year. So you need to have a viable plan for doing that. And because as soon as the nonprofit is starting, costs automatically begin, because you have to run your program or whatever you're trying to do with the nonprofit, right? And doing good, remember it's a business, doing good costs money, right? So you need to have a plan as to how you are going to, for the first 60, 90 days, what is your plan for beginning to generate some income if you have not started previously with generating income for the nonprofit? So that's important as well. All right, question number 4. Can a nonprofit make a profit? This question, I always laugh when I get it because it's probably the biggest myth that is out there about a nonprofit and that a nonprofit can't make money. Absolutely, a nonprofit can make money, and you need to make money because, like I said before, you are running a business. Number one, what is your business? Doing good, and doing good costs lots and lots and lots of money. I can tell you from experience, doing good is not cheap. Doing good costs money, so you have to make money. You have nonprofits like Susan G. Komen, the YMCA, the NFL. Until about, I think 3 or 4 years ago now, was a nonprofit. And so you have to make money. And yes, you can make millions of dollars. A nonprofit can make millions of dollars. The difference between a nonprofit and a for-profit is that every single cent that a nonprofit makes must be put back into the running of that program, running of the nonprofit, fulfilling its mission. So you can't have partners, you can't have investors, you can't have folks stocks, you can't have payouts and bonuses to people just because they're on the board or because they've helped you get started. You can't have any of that stuff. All the money that you make goes back into the running of the nonprofit. And that can mean paying salaries, the cost of running programs, any of that stuff. And yes, you can have a profit, and you can have a profit at the end of the year. As a matter of fact, that's good to have a profit at the end of the year that you're carrying over into the next year, because it shows that that the nonprofit is sustainable, right? So when you start looking for grants, when you start looking for sponsorships, some of the requests may be to see what your financials are, to talk about kind of like what your expenses look like in relation to your income, to see what do you have left to work with, right? So yes. A nonprofit can and should make a profit. Now, where a nonprofit may see some issues when it comes to profit making is if your profits in relation to the expense on programs or running the nonprofit seems out of whack, right? So if you make $1 million profit and you've spent $20,000 in programs, that may seem a little, what's happening here, right? So keeping the profit margin reasonable for the mission of your nonprofit is also best practice to do that. So yes, a nonprofit can make profit. It should be making profit as well. 5th question, what happens when a nonprofit closes down? Lots of times when I have folks who come to me about starting a nonprofit, one of the questions I ask them is, do you know what happens to the nonprofit if the board decides that it wants to dissolve, right? And you have to complete all this paperwork, dissolution paperwork. But if the board decides that this nonprofit is no longer viable, it's no longer sustainable, and it is not merged with, let's say, another nonprofit, and the board decides that we're going to dissolve this nonprofit, the board or the founder just doesn't get to take all the assets, whether it's money, computers, a pen, whatever is purchased using nonprofit funds, the board or the founder doesn't get to just take those and ride off into the sunset. Absolutely not. If a nonprofit closes down or dissolves, all of its assets, anything that was bought using those nonprofit funds, whether it's you bought a building, you bought land, you bought office supplies, you bought computers, you bought laptops, furniture, whatever it is that was purchased needs to be donated and given to another nonprofit who's doing similar work. You can also look at the laws in your states, because some states, if a nonprofit is dissolving, a judge actually will determine what happens to those assets. But the board nor the founder, you don't get to walk away with anything. Why? Because you don't own a nonprofit. It's owned by the people of that state. And so all that asset goes back to the people of that state, right? And it goes back in that form. You can decide as a board which nonprofit will be the beneficiary of the assets of the nonprofit that's being dissolved, or a judge can decide what happens with that nonprofit's assets. But the founder nor the board, it doesn't matter how much money you think that you have put into this nonprofit or sank into it, those are all considered donations for which you have gotten a tax receipt and you've already received your benefit for that. It doesn't matter. None of that property, none of those assets belong to you and can be taken with you when that nonprofit dissolves, right? Question number 6. Before I go to question number 6, we're kind of halfway through. If you're watching, let me know, is this information helpful? Or is this information so far helpful for you? If you have any additional questions that you want to ask me, please feel free to put them in the comment section, and I will answer them once I get through these particular questions. But just let me know in the comment section that yes, Rachel, the information you're giving me is very helpful. So I can know, like, yeah, I'm not just talking into the wind, but it's actually being beneficial to you. All right, how can I raise money? That's question number 6. This is one of my favorite conversations to have with existing nonprofits that call me in to help them, or when folks are starting a nonprofit to kind of brainstorm. A nonprofit's financial portfolio should be as diverse as a for-profit, meaning that you shouldn't just have one stream of income. You should have different streams of income when it comes to the sustainability and making money. So fundraising, when I speak with my clients or when I talk about fundraising as it relates to a nonprofit, I'm not just talking about selling chocolate bars or doing a Facebook fundraiser or doing a comedy show and you're selling tickets. Anything that a nonprofit does to bring money in, you're fundraising. Anything at all. So whether it's writing a grant, getting sponsorships, opening a business, yes, a social enterprise, a nonprofit can start a business. Owning real estate, you can own real estate, you can own land. A nonprofit can invest. Lots of nonprofits have mutual funds, especially if they have scholarship funds. They will put that money into a mutual fund or into a fund that generates interest, so that they can get some income on that money, so it can go farther, right? So there are a variety of different ways that a nonprofit can raise money. Boards have to sit together and throw different ideas on the table. And once you throw all those ideas on the table, I call it brain dumping, right? So all the ideas in your head, and the same thing can happen if there are problems, right? And so you kind of dump all the problems on the table and you kind of sort through them, and then you put them into different categories, and then you figure out, okay, which ones we're going to keep, which ones we're not going to keep, right? So a board gets together and you throw out different ideas for fundraising. And so this can be from individual giving, which is asking folks, soliciting folks personally to give. It can be corporate giving, where you ask businesses or corporations to give to the organization. It can be grants, which is money that is normally given. It could be by your local government, federal government, a private foundation, a business may even have a grant sometimes. And that's money that doesn't have to be paid back. Sponsorships, maybe it's a particular program or you're having a particular event. And like I said, then you may start a business. A nonprofit may actually start a business. You may start a storefront. That's a physical business. Or you may start an online business, and the products and whatever you're doing and selling is directly related to your mission. There are nonprofits who own apartment buildings and they do housing. They're in the housing business, the real estate business. There are nonprofits that own cafes. They own Airbnbs. I mean, there's a variety of ways that a nonprofit can get involved in starting a business. However, as with everything else, the business that is started needs to be related to the mission of that nonprofit. So whatever business you're starting, it can't be that you're in the business of providing resources to the homeless, and you are, let's say, let me see, you are starting the business of, I'm trying to think of something that is so unrelated. You're starting the business of selling sports memorabilia. On that, there's honestly, there's no way that if I came into an organization that was doing that, you can explain to me how they correlate, right? And so the business that is started by the nonprofit, it needs to be related to the mission. It's called a social enterprise. A social enterprise can also be a business that's started by an individual who does not have a nonprofit, right? So lots of times you'll see businesses that are started about doing good or about addressing an issue in the world. Like, for example, I think the company is named Water, and I think it comes in like a blue biodegradable box. And that company can be considered, and you see them in, I think I've seen them in, where you buy your bulk, not Sam's Club, the other one. I forgot the name of it is, but you could buy them bulk. But I believe it's called Water is the name of the company and what's on it. But it's in a biodegradable box. And the sole purpose of this company is for every bottle of water that's sold, it goes towards a country or community that has scarce water resources, right? So it's a company that started as for profit. It's not a nonprofit. It's selling a product, but that product and the monies that they're raising, that they're earning, not all of it, I'm assuming. But they started this company to sell this water in this biodegradable box as a way to support a community that has scarce water resources, right? So a social enterprise can also be started as, without someone having a nonprofit. And then it's also frequently a nonprofit will start a business, and most times it will be a social enterprise because it's a business that started to help fund or help to solve or help to bring resources to a particular social issue. Does that make sense? I hope that makes sense. So how to raise money? You have to diversify. You have to get creative, especially in this day and age of COVID, where folks, their income is limited. You may have companies, and now they're starting to crawl out a little bit, but you may have companies that may not be giving as many sponsorships. You may have grants that may be a little sparse or scarce. Scarce is a word. I'm saying sparse. Scarce and sparse, and hard to find, for whatever the work that you are doing, but they're still out there. So if you diversify your financial portfolio by having different streams of income, the same principle that works for your personal life. If you have various streams of income as a nonprofit, then you can you'll be more sustainable than a nonprofit that only depends on one or two streams of income. Normally they're grants and sponsorship, and those are not really reliable sources of income to depend on for the majority of the money that you need to fund your organization, until you become probably a long-standing nonprofit or nonprofit that's dealing with on a large scale an issue like homelessness or veterans, etc. And you could deal with them on a law hundreds of thousands. a year for small to middle-sized organization. Grants are great, don't get me wrong. If you see a grant that your organization can apply for, please apply for it. What I am saying though is grants should not be the majority of your income. So most of the income of the nonprofit should not be coming from grants. It's pretty much what I'm saying. Diversify that portfolio. All right, number 7, can I pay nonprofit expenses out of my pocket? Now, when a founder starts a nonprofit, normally they will be out-of-pocket expenses because the nonprofit has not been started yet. Some founders will fundraise within their not community, but within their network. They may say, look, they may do a GoFundMe, they may do a Facebook fundraiser. They may say, look, I really want to start this nonprofit. This is what it's going to cost, and I'm asking my friends and family or my network to donate so I have the funds to start. That's one option. The most frequent option is folks just pay the cost out of their pocket. Now, once that nonprofit is formed and a board is formed, any expenses for that nonprofit needs to come from the nonprofit pot. So if you don't have any money, then there should not be any expenditures. You should not be spending money. If there are expenditures that need to happen, then guess what? The board needs to sit down and figure out how are we going to bring in income and what's the timeline for this expenditure, because you can't spend what you don't have. And if you spend money out of your pocket, it does not mean that you're going to get it back. The board has to decide that, okay, you spent this money to get the organization started. You have your receipts. You spent X amount of money up until the point the organization gets started. Because after it gets started, that's something the board needs to sort out when it comes to expenses. You should still not be coming out of pocket. And I tell folks, if you decide to come out of pocket after the board starts, then that's a donation. You should not be expecting that back after the organization starts, become a legal organization. Because you really need to get into practice, founders especially, of doing business correctly. However, there's been cases where the board has decided after it has started that they will repay the founder the monies that he or she divvied out in order to get the organization started. So the board decides on that. The board decides on the timeline, like we're going to pay X amount over the course of this time, because the board has to figure out how you're going to get the money. It's your responsibility. How are we going to get this money, right? So there have been times when boards have done that, and it's totally within their right. So you should not be paying nonprofit expenses out of your pocket. If you are paying a nonprofit expenses out of your pocket, it does not mean that you get that money back because you're the founder and you've spent it. No, that is a board decision. Means majority vote says, yes, we will repay. My strongest urge, best practice is once that organization has legally started, there should not be any personal expenses coming out of folks' pocket. The board should really take ownership of expenses and figure out how we're going to pay for whatever needs to be paid for, whether it's a fundraiser or whatever other ways for getting the funds that's needed, which is why it's important when you start a nonprofit and you get the board on board, that you set goals, that you do a goal session where you're doing a strategic planning, where you're setting goals, and one of them needs to be financial goals. So within the first 6 months, you may not have a penny. So in the first 6 months, all you may be doing is just fundraising and figuring out what streams of income can we sustain, right? And so that's really, really important to do and get in the practice of doing that, and not get in the practice of coming out of your pocket personal expenses to pay for something that is a nonprofit related expense. Now, we know that sometimes, for example, let me see. I don't know, maybe you have a program that's for kids and something comes on sale and it's really inexpensive and it's something that the nonprofit needs. You're not the person who has a nonprofit card, so you contact the nonprofit, hey, these are on sale, and you grab it. And folks may say, yep, go ahead and grab it and you can expense it back and we'll just reimburse you, right? So we have situations like that. What I'm saying is that you just going out and spending money because you're the founder or because you're a board member and you thought it would be cool to purchase a particular item, and the board has no clue, and then you're going to come to the board after the fact and say, hey, I bought this, I want my money back. Yeah, that's not how any of this works. Right? So my suggestion is no. My answer will always be no. You should not be paying nonprofit expenses out of your pocket, with the caveat that at the beginning, before you actually legalize this nonprofit, that might be something you need to do. Or with discussion with the board, there may be some discussion about that and how that plays out. All right. Number 8 is a follow-up to question number 7. So question number 7 was, can nonprofit expenses be out of pocket? Number 8 is, what is a board give and get? And the first answer to out of pocket expenses is, have you established a board give and get? So a board give and get is the minimum amount of money that board members are expected to give every year. So not every nonprofit has a different amount. I sit on a couple of boards. One is $1,000 for the year. The other one is $500 for the year. So I know that for me, $1,500, I have to either give it out of my pocket. So I write a check, $1,000 to one organization and $500 to the other, or I can get it, meaning within my network, I am fundraising $1,000 or $500, right? Or I may get $1,000 sponsorship from a business, right? So the board, there should be a board give and get, and there should be a date in the year when that money is due. For one organization, it's May 15th. For the other organization, you have the whole year. You can give over time, but you have the whole year to give it, right? So that board give and get should be a part of your budget. So for example, the organization that I give $500 a year for, the due date for that give and get is May 15th. There's about 7 of us on the board. So that's $3,500 that the nonprofit knows it will have by May 15th. So as it looks at the budget and looks at expenses, it can begin to expense out knowing that, this is when board members, this is when we'll have $3,500. Now, the other thing I would also recommend with a give and get, and this is something that I practice on one of the boards I sit on, is to have board members kind of estimate when they think they can have their board give and get in. Because some folks, I always have mine in before May 15th, right? So for budget purposes, especially if you're a startup nonprofit, you can have an idea like, okay, February, we'll probably have $1,000 coming from board give and get. We'll have some fundraisers, right? So that really goes towards the expenses of the organization. So the board give and get should be kind of like the base. If you get nothing else for the year, no other monies for the year, you need to have a board give and get. Why? Because the board is responsible for the nonprofit, number 1. Number 2, charity starts at home. If your own board members are not giving or not invested in making this nonprofit viable through taking their financial responsibilities seriously, then how can you expect others to do the same? That's 1. Number 2, sometimes there are grants that ask, what percentage of your income is the board responsible for? Like essentially, what is your board give and get? For one of the nonprofits I sit on, it's 10%. The board is responsible for 10% of the organization's annual income. So when we do our budgets, if we're saying we're going to raise $60,000 for the year, the board is responsible for $6,000, right? And so, sorry, my glasses. Okay, yeah, fix it. So we know that there's 7 of us, so $3,500 we already know will come from board give and get. The other $2,500, we got to figure out as a board, how are we going to get that in? Because the board is responsible for 10% of the budget, right? And that's something that we kind of agree on. Every nonprofit is going to be different. Your board give and get maybe $200. You may have different levels. So if you have students on your board, it might be less, so it really depends. There are nonprofit boards where give and get is $5,000 for the board. And it's either give or get, meaning that you're giving it out of pocket. You're writing a check for $5,000, or in your network, you are raising $5,000. And the board give and get is just, like I said, the minimum. Just because you're giving your $5,000 or your $1,000 or your $500 doesn't mean that your financial responsibilities end there. No, you're still responsible as a board member for the sustainability, the financial sustainability of that organization. So you have to still be involved in fundraising, still be involved in getting funds and managing the nonprofit's financial portfolio. All right, question number 9. We're almost at the end, y'all. Does the founder of a nonprofit have the final say? No, they do not. If the founder sits on the board, because I've worked with some boards where the founder is not a board member. But they have all the say, and which is fine. You can definitely have folks attend board meetings that are not on the board, right? Because like I said, a nonprofit is a public entity. And so if anyone wants to attend a board meeting, they can. There are certain stipulations for what will be a closed meeting when you're talking about certain topics. But for the most part, if anybody wants to attend a board meeting, they can just say, I want to attend your next board meeting, and they're permitted to attend. So a founder does not have the final say. The board, majority vote, has the final say. Now, in my many years of experience, there have been nonprofit founders who somehow, when they've done their bylaws or whatever the case is, have given the person who started a nonprofit more than just one vote, right? So their vote, whatever percent they have. So the board may be 49% vote and theirs count for 51%. So regardless of what happens, they still have the final say. That is not a best practice. That is not healthy. That does not sustain a nonprofit. And personally, I will never sit on a board where the founder has, where the bylaws include that type of language, right? It's, in my opinion, it's dangerous. So the founder does not have the final say. The founder can sit on the board and be a board member and have one vote like everybody else. Before you join a nonprofit board, you need to make it your business to read their bylaws and the articles of incorporation. Ignorance or I don't know is not an excuse in a court of law. When the state or the federal government comes looking for you, you cannot say I didn't know, right? So you got to be responsible when you are joining a nonprofit board to make sure you do your due diligence to check these things. That's one. And number two, when you yourself are starting a nonprofit, you need to look at these best practices and ensure that the foundation on which you are building a nonprofit, because the idea is that a nonprofit should outlive you. It's not about you, it's about the work. It's not something you can pass on to your children. It's not something you can take with you when you pass on. It's a publicly owned business, and so you need to make sure that when you are setting up the nonprofit that you and your board that starts this off, you're thinking long term. Last question: does the nonprofit need insurance if you don't have employees? Yes. Yes, 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 please. A nonprofit needs board insurance. So you need insurance that covers board members, because if anything happens with that nonprofit, you get sued, you have an event and someone gets hurt, a board member, tongue in cheek says something publicly that causes some type of whatever with the nonprofit. There are things that happen that we live in a litigious society. You need to ensure that you have board insurance. Every nonprofit organization that exists should have board insurance. I cannot say this enough. And there are so many out there that do not. That is dangerous. You're living really dangerously when you have a nonprofit with a board and there's no coverage for this board. None. So if something happens, you're really personally responsible then, right? Because debtors, the nonprofit gets sued, you have no board insurance or no insurance. Guess who's covering that? The board. The lawyer fees, that's coming out of pocket from if the nonprofit doesn't have enough money in its coffers, the board is responsible for that, right? So nonprofit insurance is really, really important. When you're having an event, get event insurance. Now, there are some board insurances that also cover events, or if you have obviously if you have a nonprofit that has staff, you need to make sure you get your workers' comp, and other types of accidental insurance, other types of insurances that cover staff, what is required by law in your state, right? But if you just have a volunteer board, you still need to make sure you have insurance. You still need to make sure you have event insurance. And event insurance is a couple $100, and you just pay for it when you have an event. Why? Because if something goes wrong, right? And every event insurance is different. You may have some that cover if you have to cancel because of a natural disaster or no fault of your own, or even if it's a fault of your own, you have to cancel, reimbursing costs. If someone gets hurt at your event and they want to sue, or they want some coverage for me being hurt, you make sure you have your event insurance. If you travel out the country as part of your nonprofit work, I need to make sure one of two things happen. Either the folks who are traveling with you have traveler's insurance, or you need to tack it on to your insurance when you're traveling. It's really, really important that you have insurance, right? Because insurance reduces the personal out-of-pocket cost to that board and to that organization, right? So that is question number 10. Any other questions before I kind of wrap up? I know it was a lot of information, but I wanted to make sure that I gave you as much information as possible so you can make some decisions about starting a nonprofit. And if you're currently part of a nonprofit and some of these things sound very strange to you, or you're like, oh my goodness, I didn't know that, I would suggest you revisit. You revisit your board and your bylaws and have some of these discussions with them. All right. So any other questions? While I'm waiting to see if there's any other questions, let me just mention some closing thoughts here. If you would like to schedule a nonprofit wellness checkup, and nonprofit wellness checkups, I always say that just like any other living organism, a nonprofit is a living organism, and it needs checkups to make sure that everything is functioning correctly. If you need to schedule a nonprofit wellness checkup because you are part of a nonprofit, or you may have started a nonprofit and the board has decided, look, we need somebody to come and just see what we're doing and see if we're doing it correctly, see if we're doing okay, check our heart, check our lungs, check our kidneys, make sure we're all right. You can schedule a nonprofit wellness checkup with me. If you are considering starting a nonprofit, or if the nonprofit currently exists and you just need some help, you can schedule a nonprofit exploration session. And you can schedule both of those with me through kingdomlegacypartnerships.com, right? So if you go to kingdomlegacypartnerships.com, just go to that website, there will be a link there so that you can schedule a session, one of those two sessions, directly with me. In addition to those sessions, Teresa and I are also partnering to host a nonprofit masterclass. And the nonprofit masterclass will be a 3-part working session. So you are going to walk away from this masterclass, these 3 sessions, by the time we're done, with a plan, right? You're going to walk away with better situated to make the nonprofit viable and to make it sustainable. Those dates are going to be June 28th, July 7th, and July 14th. The masterclass, it's one masterclass that's in 3 different sessions, and the sessions are going to build on each other, right? So be sure to attend as well. So it doesn't look like I have any questions. Let me just check. Let me just check where I've shared it to see. I don't see any on here, but it doesn't mean that there's none. Let me see. Okay, I don't see any questions. So if you have, all right, if you have questions, if you watch this on the replay and you have questions, you can post the questions under this video and I will answer them. If you think of a question after you're on with me live now and you think of a question later, certainly you can post the questions in the comment section, and I'll be periodically checking, or I'll probably get a little alert when you've posted a question. Right. So thank you so much for the opportunity to share with you tonight my expertise, just my wisdom. I'm always excited to do that. Teresa, thanks again for the invite and this wonderful, wonderful opportunity. And I hope the information that was provided tonight is helpful and is useful for you. All right. So until I see you again, good night.